What's going on, YouTube? This your boy Avery Haynes. It's another installment of Facts Over Feelings. Leave your feelings at the door so we can get to the facts. I want to jump right into it and first apologize to my viewers for the last, videos. I know that you couldn't really hear because of the music, and I was just in my feelings. That's when it was feelings over facts. I ain't seen my son in a couple months. It was Father's Day. I just wasn't feeling too good, and the music was helping me to get through the video. But I'm back, re-energized. So here we go. Let's get right into it. So what I wanted to talk about, first was a comment that I had read from a sister in the comment section, and it was just the concern that we show in terms of how important our clarity is, right? Because many times, even if we receive information, it still is muddied in our mind because we're trying to figure out how do we use it. how can we make it effective? That is not so much as we see the use in it, but how effective can it be? The efficacy of the solutions that we present is just as important as presenting the solution itself. So if we can't use any of the information that we go over, like you said, what is it all for? But what I'm saying too, when I talked about mental preparation, please let's not marginalize that. When we talk about being mentally prepared and who we're in the ring with, okay, that's what I'm trying to get you brothers and sisters to understand. If you were to walk into the ring and you could see that your opponent is a child, you wouldn't care what the child had in his boxing gloves. Brass knuckles could be in his boxing gloves. You wouldn't care. You wouldn't care what type of advantage the child would have because it's a child, right? Correct? But replace that child with Mike Tyson, and he has brass knuckles in his boxing gloves. I think you're gonna prepare a little bit differently. I think that you might go in that ring with a little bit of trepidation. Am I right? So the reality of it is, if you know that you're forced to fight that opponent, and say for instance you're even given an opportunity to train, how much harder would you train? How much more focused would you be? So you don't understand who you're in the ring with. That's partly the reason as to why, as a lot of this is going over people's heads. When like I said, and I said it, obviously we in a diplomatic way, simple conversation, as I replied back to the sister, beautiful sister, and I told her, I said, look, hey, when do we want to fast? When I talked about fasting, when I talked about physical preparation, exercising as much as we possibly could, when I talked about supplies, when do we wait to get supplies? When we need them, when you may need a first aid kit available or a tourniquet. When do you go into fast? When the grocery stores close down? When there's a blackout, or when there's limited supplies, and you have to choose between you and your child eating? Okay, it may seem like a no-brainer, but after a while it would tax anybody. Okay, and so when do you want to physically prepare? When 5, 6, or 7 people jump on you to take your possessions and your valuables? Do you get where you get where I'm going with brothers and sisters? It's mentally prepared. Know who you're in the ring with, and the rest will take care of itself. So what I wanted to say too as well, what do we look at when we take a look at 2020 this year? What is the pattern that we see being that's overly, that's obviously evident, but we really, like we said, we haven't internalized it. We talk about it, but has it moved us to action, right? So when we look at the pattern that has been created in 2020, we see what they put in front of us, but we pay less attention to what's in the background. And that's kind of like what we should be doing, paying attention to what's in the background. Because what was in the front of us? In the front of us, and in front of our front view was Kobe Bryant's death. In the background was the coronavirus. Okay, now in the front of us, there was the coronavirus. In the background, there was racial tension. Now, in the front of us, there's racial tension. And in the background, there's a war between India and China. You see, and so when you have a war between superpowers, supposedly, we never understand that there's history. That's like, why is China and India beefing? There's a history behind that. Okay, and the history is such as, when, remember, we talked about in the last video, we brought up the Opium Wars. Now I say this to talk about, let me back up just a little bit, and then we'll go back to that concept. When we talk about the dates, you have to understand the when affects the how, the why, and the who dramatically, does it not? If I get into a debate with an individual and I'm talking about who's the best between LeBron and Michael Jordan, and I get one number wrong, I don't even know what I'm talking about after that, do I? If I say Jordan only won 4 championships, or he was drafted number 2, or LeBron's only won one, if your numbers is off, all your information is off. That's what you have to understand. So that's why I'm trying to get you to understand the importance of these dates. So what did we go over? We went over the Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842, the first one, which was small because I think only 5,000 troops of British troops had actually participated in that war. But still, it started later on. Led to the Second War, which from 1856 to 1860, and we're going to show you why those dates are significant. But the point that we're making out of that was when they were pushing the opium, they were pushing it through India. Okay, India and Calcutta, West Bengal, this area was where they were building their ships so they could transport their opium. Because the European, like we talked about, this is the infancy of the Industrial Revolution between this time, 1760 to 1825, but they were horrible at shipbuilding. That's why my brother's going to be, oh man, the Europeans had all these ships. Garbage. Wouldn't have mattered, because what did we establish? They'll even go through the history of their seafaring abilities or lack thereof. Okay, they suffered, 2/3 of their ships suffered from what was called floundering, where the water would build up in the boat, destroying their cargo. All right, so the water was actually on top of the deck. Okay, and 1/3 of the ships, the remaining ones, right, were crashed. We already had said in the previous video, what? Out of the 4 voyages that Columbus has known to take, he crashed 9 ships. Okay, you have to understand who you're dealing with. Stop inflating them. Stop exaggerating their claims. Stop doing that. We're making their story larger than what it really actually was. So the point being is that they use India as a medium to obviously subvert the power of the Qing dynasty, because the Qing dynasty was in power at that time, and then hence from those Opium Wars you opened up 5 ports because only one was open to Europeans, and they were subject to the laws of China. They hated that. Okay, so they opened up 5 ports, and then the treaties that was in 1898. Like we said, we know that Hong Kong was taken from China along with 200 other islands and territories. Okay, and from that, like we said, that birthed and gave power as it began to build momentum into creating the Republic of China. Okay, the modern day boogeyman we see. Okay, so when those Opium Wars destabilized China economically and socially, what you also have simultaneously is wars going on in the Western Hemisphere, right? Over here in the colonies. What do we say? We talked about how, during its infancy, it was very, very small. Very, very small, okay? So, and I'm tying all of this back in, so be patient with me, brothers and sisters. In 1763, we know that you have a proclamation line set by King George III, all right? Which stated that you couldn't go west of the Appalachian Mountains. Infuriated the settlers, okay? Now, when you take a look at those colonies that were all on those coasts, small as shit. Matter of fact, the first consensus was in 1790, where they, started taking numbers, started taking count. Now, of course, we know they didn't count certain people, but the fact of the matter being is that there were only 5 cities that had a population of, there were only a few cities that had a population over 10,000 people. I think 5, obviously. And one was New York, which had 33,000. Okay, the other one was Boston, which had 18,000. Then you had Philadelphia and Charleston, which had like 13,000, 16,000 that is. And then you had Baltimore, which had 13,000, right? So like we said before, also knowing, look at these dates, we're going to bring it all back. 1787 was the Philadelphia Convention. This is where they convened in secret, these 55 delegates, not all at the same time, but this is where they convened, right? And people and then historians say, oh, well, they had to meet in secret because they didn't want to cause party discord. Negative. If they were there, party discord with who? The first 6 presidents were elected by the same party, one party called the Democratic Republican Party. The United States had this one party for the first 6 presidents. Okay? And the second official party of the United States was called the Anti-Masonic Party. So this is how scared we were of secret organizations coming together and trying to get a military to back their dollar, because that's the only thing that would make their money worth something, considering the fact that it was not backed by any gold or silver. Okay? So the point being is that anytime you have a group of people meeting in secret, and the population isn't that big to begin with, it wouldn't have mattered if they told the Indians, it wouldn't have mattered if they told blacks, because at that time, the vast majority of us didn't even speak their language. So who were they keeping a secret to? The infighting that was going on. Like we said, that's what we're establishing. This was a global effort already. This new idea of globalization is nothing new. They told you they were doing this before. They called themselves conquistadors. So we're saying that what we're talking about is we're establishing that as in the 14th the 15th centuries onward is this expansion of European power. This is how it comes about, but there's a lot of infighting while this is going on. There wasn't this strong sense of solidarity like we're led to believe all the time. So that's what I'm trying to get you to know. One, what we've already established is that there was a history between India and China as this hostility was brewed or heightened because of the Opium Wars. All right, and then we also know, for a side note, in 1900 you had what was called the Boxer Rebellion, where you had France, Japan, Germany, the United States all come together to quell a rebellion in China because they were sick and tired of European influence, and it was headed by a general by the name of Count von Waldersee, which was a German general. Okay, so this, like I said, these are constant efforts. 1898, what did we say about that date? That was the date that they had split up, or took Hong Kong from China, and also took 200 islands and territories, as well as what? 1898 is the Congo Conference, where them Europeans split up Africa amongst themselves. So stop leading yourself with this narrative as if they took some slaves and never returned, or just was taking slaves and left. Yeah, we're gonna leave the niggas to themselves. Negative. Negative. And I'm going to jump off into another point to prove that. And so what do we know? We also know from the population that they were small. What do we also know from the proclamation line of 1763 set by King George? That their population was small. That they didn't have as many slaves as they were leading you to believe. This was a war land where you had West and East Florida controlled by the Spanish. A territory. So these territories, don't look at Florida like what you see now on the map. It was a territory. Just like the Louisiana territory that was controlled by who else? Napoleon, France. That's why it was called the Louisiana Purchase. But you looking at Louisiana like the state of Louisiana. No, it included Louisiana plus 15 other states. Territories were bigger than states. Then you go west, you got all that territory being controlled by the Indians in Mexico. They didn't control nothing here. They fought for it. Okay, that's what you have to understand. So when we take a look at those dates, what do we understand? Because what am I trying to prove to? I'm trying to prove to you that there will be no power if there is no central bank behind a central government. Okay, so when we took a look at we're gonna wrap this up. 1781 through 1789. Okay, 1781 is the establishment of what? Okay, also the start, respectively, of where they say that's when the Continental Congress starts up. You have the first Continental Congress, the second Continental Congress, then you have the Confederation Congress. Okay, so they say the timeline is respectively between 1781 and 1789. Right? That these governments exist. This is your American government at this time. The first Continental Congress, they were just meeting. The second Continental Congress, they have a militia now behind them. But also, no matter which Continental Congress you're talking about, they don't have the power to tax the colonies. Okay, they're relying on, donations and stuff. And they're being funded by France, obviously. And who run France at the time? Napoleon. And who was Napoleon battled with? The British. And who are the British? This is a convergence of England and Scotland when they got together in 1707. Okay, they're vying for power. And that's when we go back. See how I got to jump back because I got these dates. When did they defeat Napoleon? In 1815, Battle of Waterloo. Okay, now remember when I said how I go back and how I make this all make sense? You go back to the Second Opium War of 1856 to 1860. Now France is along with Britain invading China so that it can open up its ports to sell them opium. So they go through all this fighting, all this time, the Napoleonic Wars, but they don't fight too much to where they can't go in the yellow man's country and go kick his door down to sell him opium. See how they feign? Because they know this is the point of secret societies. They know, they tell their members, there will be sacrifices made by us and our own people to convince, that's how far we have to convince these people of color that, we can cause that in order to cause division, because while we're making these arrangements and these so-called connections with people, in reality what we're doing is we're there to plant the seeds of division until we can leave, and then they'll be divided and won't even know how it came about. Don't we see that as the present day circumstances all across the globe? You see what I'm saying? So when we take a look at all these things, like I was telling people before, how, there was no creation of a central government without the creation of the bank. So now what you have is in 1789. Now, mind you, 1789, when it ends, okay, because the Continental is collapsing. Even though France is still backing the colonies at this time, is collapsing. We had our first army then. George Washington, he in a military garb, ain't he? And that wasn't the US dollar. George Washington is on the US dollar. So it couldn't have been our money back then. Think about this, brothers and sisters. They already had money and it already failed. That's why I was telling you the book by Griffin when he talked about the creature from Jekyll Island. Great, but he missed on the point because he only goes halfway. And why does he only go halfway? Because he tells you and he leads, and this was something that he had, had said in a documentary. He had, which he's right, he's correct, but we have to go deeper than that when he stated that, when you take a look at empires of the past, fiat currency had always failed and always broken those empires. But you don't have to go back that far. You just have to go back to the history of this nation. And you understand that before this dollar was created and power was backing it, that we had dollars before and it had already failed. You don't have to go back that far. You see what I'm saying? So the Continental failed, and then so at this time you got these individuals getting together, and they're like, look, let's get a central bank behind us. But they're so scared of a central bank because these individuals, from what history suggests to us, are so scared of monarch rule. So therefore they've already came from that. They're like, look, we're tired of kings and queens. We want representation, but this only because they want their businesses and they want an opportunity to become kings and queens themselves. Okay, and we'll prove that. And so how do we know that? We take a look at three key individuals who wrote the Federalist Papers. These individuals are the name of James Madison, go by the names of James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Now, John Jay to a lesser degree in crafting, the Constitution. But we do know that they, like I said, they wrote under the pseudonym called Publius. Okay, and in it, these Federalist Papers were there to convince the rest of the colonies are like, look, hey, let's get this bank started. Let's get a new currency. We got new backers, and we'll do it with them. Because it went back to the British. Because really what you see, they were being funded by France. Now they're going right back to look, let's be financed by them now. Okay? And then they'll back us and they'll stabilize our banks. So at first they weren't with it because they're like, okay, if we do this, we already know what they like. We already know what the crown is like. So we got to get some measures set in place. And so what is ratified in 1789? Like we said, look at this date, the Constitution. But the Constitution is only ratified because the colonies say you got to throw in a Bill of Rights with that too as well, to ensure that if we go along with this, they don't snatch our power back up. Because what you have to understand that is critical to your understanding to know who you're in the ring with. The people are considered corporations. Even politically, when you look it up, corporations are considered to be people. When has that? You think they just now came up with that? When they wrote that, they wrote it for themselves, not you. To protect themselves. That's what I'm trying to get you to understand. We're just taking advantage of the language, but we see how little it really actually works for us in reality. You see what I'm saying? So what you have is the Bill of Rights comes about in 1791, is ratified. What pops up in 1791? Then the central bank. Because mind you, like we said, in 1781, with the First Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, and the Confederation Congress, 1781, you had the Bank of North America. Okay? But that ended up failing. Because like I said, the Continental was collapsing and everything like that. So they get together again and said, no, look, we got some new financiers. These bad boys is going to back us, and we know these to be the Jews. Okay? And it just is what it is. But the point being is that when they established, they said, okay, give us the Bill of Rights. They initially came with 12, but then accepted 10. Okay? And once that was ratified, now you have the First Bank of America. Now, and it's interesting, like we talk about the power grab, that James Madison becomes a president, Alexander Hamilton becomes treasurer of that bank, and John Jay becomes a Supreme Court justice. Okay? So why is that also significant? And then we're going to give an example just out of the least of those individuals. One person you might not know, because probably know of Alexander Hamilton, you probably know of James Madison, right? Popular positions that they had taken, Secretary of Treasury and also the President of the United States. But what you don't know, John Jay became a Supreme Court justice. And there's an interesting case that he ruled in, which was Chisolm versus Georgia in 1793, where the descendants of Chisolm, who stayed in South Carolina, wanted some bonds back from the state of Georgia that they had gotten from the Revolutionary War. And Georgia states, oh no, we got our sovereignty via the federal government. We ain't got to give you back nothing. And then the Supreme Court rules in favor of Georgia 4-1. And the only dissenting voice was by Justice Wilson, who said, look, the sovereignty from the state is given by the people. So by default, if the states are given their sovereignty by the federal government, if the states are given their sovereignty by the people, then in turn, and the states give their sovereignty to the federal government, it's the federal government's sovereignty is given to them by the people. by default. So Wilson declared an unpopular argument that sovereignty is given to the federal government via the people. And so what did they do? They ratified the 11th Amendment, which stated what? That if you're not from a state, you can't sue that state to this day. Okay? So power grab, and then power, as they grab their power, they take power away from you. You see what I'm saying? But you see, after they got that document ratified and after they gave them the Bill of Rights, they've been trying to undermine it ever since then. Because once people got their power, that's all they wanted. Because when that bank was established in 1791, the first Bank of America, what happened? It was established and 1/5 of the assets was only controlled by the federal government. The rest of it were controlled by private investors. That's what you need to know. If it was written for you, why? And then people say, like, what do we already establish? We don't care if they did it in secret. We don't care if they would have had Africans at the meeting, Indians at the meeting. We didn't speak their language. So who was they in secret with? They didn't want it to get back to their current financiers, which was France. That was a power at that time. Literally, like we said, literally the middle of the continent, the so-called continent, or the middle of North America was ran by France. We're talking about all the way up to Canada. Remember, the French and Indian War is not the French against the Indians. It was the French who had sided with the Indians as they were warring against the British who were siding with the Iroquois Federation. They both took Indians and took sides of these Indians. And then before you knew it, the Indians and us, like we always eventually end up fighting against one another while they disappear into the background. But they knew there would be casualties. They knew there would be sacrifices. So we go forward, we move forward. In 1791, these banks were chartered for 20 years. Okay, so by 1791, by 1811, right, the bank comes up to be rechartered. They say no. Okay, it's too much power in a few people's hands. So for 5 years, it's a system called Wildcat Banking. It's just whoever currency is popping and whoever got a gang of marauders that can back up their currency, that's what's cracking unless you got gold or silver, right? And so by 1816, they say, look, we'll try it again. This is when you get the second bank of North America, right? Or the second bank. And so when that bank comes about, when it's time to be rechartered again, they try to recharter it early. They pushing it by 1834, right? Or 1832 rather, 4 years before it's supposed to be rechartered again. They say, no, we're not going to do it. Andrew Jackson's like, hey, nope, I'm taking the money out of the federal banks and I'm putting it in my banks. And I'm basically helping who out because we already know him. This, mind you, like we said, we keep it in the back of our head. This has nothing to do with you. It has nothing to do with the common man and woman. Okay, so what he ends up doing is this Wildcat Banking, and then he passes what's called the Circuli Specie in 1836 and states that the only thing, which states you can only buy land with gold and silver. Okay, crashes the dollar, right, for 7 years. Okay, and so then we know shortly afterwards you have a civil war by 1860. And then after the Civil War, you have financial institutions ran by Jay Cooke and J.P. Morgan, which controlled things into the advent of the Federal Reserve, which was established in 1913. Okay, so you see the establishment of the central bank, and mind you, like I said, legal tender. It's only about who's military because I'm not backing this by any gold or silver. I'm backing it by a military. This is one of the reasons why, like we see, when anyone is at odds with the U.S. dollar or doesn't want to spend it, then somehow you see our government cook up justification for a war because the only thing that is backing that dollar is the military. You cannot say legal tender, something you're able to legally do without the law being able to enforce it. And you can't enforce law without a military. That's what you need to know. So when we talk about, like I was saying before, what's the point of all this? These were globalized efforts because, some people say, even when I was talking about repatriation in Africa, the British were doing it. This is why I let you know that slavery wasn't as big as what they make it. I'm going to give you two big instances, very big, powerful examples, right, that we overlook. But mind you, it's about these dates. It helps us to put things into perspective. Now, in 1787, this is the time of the convention when these people are meeting in secret. Some of these people, like Thomas Jefferson, they're over in England while this is going on. Okay? And so in 1787, what are the British thinking about? They're like, you know what? We need to send some niggas back to Africa. So in 1787, they send 300 slaves and 70 white prostitutes okay, white female prostitutes, because you know they got to mix that color in, to Sierra Leone to establish, look at the date, 1787. Okay, the United States develops the United States Colonization Society, or the American Colonization Society, right? And they in 18, I want to say, let me get this right. It started in the early 1800s, but in the 1820s, let's just say that, because I'm not sure if it's around 1824 to be exact. But I know it's in the 1820s. They established a colony and it's established by 1847. And I know that for a fact with Liberia. But they're sending over to establish, African Americans, trying to get them to establish a colony in Africa called Liberia. But this does two things. It's misleading because it gives you this idea like, oh, they're not already there. Mind you, we already said, look at the dates. You know what I'm saying? By 1898, they're splitting up the whole continent of Africa. You see what I'm saying? So this was an effort to get Africans over there to do what? Missionary work. Because that's ultimately what it became after they saw that, taking blacks and getting them to go back to Africa wasn't successful, because most blacks were against it. History will tell you that. Because they were there. They said, oh, we're no more African than you are British. You know what I'm saying? You Americans are no more, so I'm no more African than you Americans are British now at this point in time. Negative, because most blacks felt like they were already from there. We know about the Gullah Wars, okay? So from 1739 to 1858 and all of the insurrections and rebellions in between here. So our people were warned. We know about the Seminoles. Seminoles is not an Indian. Seminole means runaway, okay? But so get this all into, perspective. They knew that they had to take over Africa because that's where all the resources were. You see what I'm saying? They had no resources of their own. So they knew that the only thing that could back the money that they would be forcing the world to spend was a military. Okay? And the importance of colonizing is making sure that the first one to the mind is the winner. So when they were sending these individuals back, they were sending them back with a Christian mindset. This is one of the reasons why these nations that we speak of have a huge Christian population right now to this day. And so you have to know that all the individuals that have power in these nations, especially when these were warmongers taking power, they were there generationally speaking. Their parents were rulers. They were given that power. So like we talked about, you have to understand that these colonization efforts or recolonization efforts or efforts at repatriation, if you will, were nothing new. So even before Garvey, this was something that they were trying to do. So how big was slavery is my point. Then you take the point. This is my second point. The invention of the cotton gin. The invention of the cotton gin is in 1793 by Eli Whitney. Now, we don't know whether or not he actually invented it. We just know that he was the first one to patent it. But I digress. The point being is if you take a look, and it is in a book, I will show you the book later on in another segment, but it's in an American Encyclopedia of History. And this is when it talks about, gives the numbers 1789 and 1790. Now, mind you, they say the 18th century, which is the 1700s, is the height of the slave trade. Okay, now from 1789 to 1790 on record, there's only about 10,000 pounds of cotton that was picked that year or distributed. You know what I'm saying? From the colonies, 10,000 pounds. Now, when the cotton, because see, let's break this down. You have something called long staple cotton and short staple cotton. Long staple cotton is grown along the coast. But the short staple cotton is what is preferred. But the short staple cotton can only be grown inland. Okay? And that's not where they didn't have control of those territories. See? You still have the reverberating effects of the 1763 proclamation line. Okay? So the best cotton has to be grown inland, but you can't grow it inland because you don't control none of that territory. And then you're small. Okay? So the fact of the matter is this is what you have to understand is that when the cotton gin was invented, it separated the seeds that are inside the fiber, which are very, very arduous. You know what I'm saying? In terms of how much labor you have to put into separating the seeds from the fabric. So the cotton gin mechanically separated those seeds from the fiber. Okay, so you go from 1789 to 1790, like I said, 10,000 pounds that year, to 1800 and 1801. Is recorded as when they got up to 10 million pounds for that year. So how much cotton were we picking? You see what I'm saying? So by 1820, that's when they're known as Cotton King. But by 1860, there's a Civil War. And then you take a look at the size of the colonies, the size of the numbers, because what does it allude to? When they make it seem like they were, remember, like you said, the 1790 consensus stated what? That it was about, the New York City had 33,000 people. So you're telling me the height of the slave trade was in the 18th century or the 1700s, and they want to tell you, inflate their ego to make it assume that they had 33,000 people and then millions of black slaves. Seriously? Or even hundreds of thousands of black slaves. You know that one going down. You know what? Nothing but war. By 1831, Nat Turner has a rebellion. You see, and it's a wealth of information. I got to cut these into 30-minute videos. So this is the first of 3. Stay tuned because we're finna tie all of this together. It's your boy, Hey Rue Haynes, Facts Over Feelings. Let's get it.